Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for choosing to spend your time here today in this beautiful liminal space that we have. Today, I am really excited to pitch to you all, kind of get on my soapbox, the case for why we should all adopt some more pessimism about AI in an age that I deem to be a little bit too optimistic. And this presentation comes out of some work that I did for the Wilson Center, a think tank in DC, the top global studies think tank for their science and technology innovation program. So for the year that I interned for them, I spent every Friday working in AI technology labs, working with mid and senior level staffers in the legislative and executive branches, teaching them about AI. I got access to some of the country's foremost AI researchers at Google and NVIDIA, Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, and even OpenAI's executive board. And my work there made me realize that what we see in the headlines and what we become familiar with in our day-to-day use of AI is not exactly lining up with what the experts know to be true. And there are some risks that get a lot of airtime, but there's also risks that kind of go undetected. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And diving right in, it's really important to get on the same page about this big question. What is AI? And just as importantly, what is AI not? Well, it's a tricky question, and not all the experts agree. So here I've pulled some of the most widely accepted and commonly used definitions of AI. And none of these definitions are perfect, but they all highlight some key capabilities. So Google, for instance, rightly points out that a major milestone for AI development has been the ability to translate and read spoken and written language. And this is a key hallmarker as we see in this graphic. Now, this is from a Microsoft study that was published just 2 weeks ago. It goes over the top and bottom 40 jobs that are exposed to AI. So this chart in particular is the jobs that have the most exposure to AI. And at the top of the list, we see interpreters and translators. And actually, almost all of the top 10 occupations that are exposed to AI have to do with writing and speaking. Another strength that most definitions get right is AI's ability to perceive and recognize patterns. I think that this is most apparent in a field like medicine. So an AI model designed by the Mayo Clinic in 2023 was able to identify pancreatic cancer in CT scans an average of 475 days before clinical diagnosis. You heard that right, an average of 475 days, not a maximum. Another really cool example is a Swedish AI model that is able to identify early stage breast cancer 20% more than a team of trained radiologists. It's cases like these that lead many to say that in terms of perception and pattern recognition, AI can beat out even seasoned professionals. Another common claim is that AI simulates human learning, and this really ties into reinforcement learning, a process where a model learns by interacting with its environment and adjusting its behavior based on feedback and rewards. Advances here are really promising. Just this June, MIT published a paper, and we see a snippet of how it works here about their self-adapting language model. It's this novel method where the LLM can generate its own training data through a process of self-editing. Because this kind of AI can update its own model weights, it's better able to adapt to new information and sort of learn on the fly. So yes, AI can be downright amazing. But a lot like a presidential campaign or a timeshare pitch, AI is really more about what we're being sold than the reality of what we have. And if we look closer at these definitions, we'll see that it's not amazing in all the ways that we might assume. So a widespread issue with AI definitions is how they conflate the ability to translate, process, and generate language with the ability to understand language and reason. AI doesn't interpret meaning like you and I do. It processes language as tokens, fragments of words that have no inherent meaning to the model. It predicts the next likely token based on patterns from its training data. That's how it simulates fluent language without actually understanding what's being said. The same goes for image generation. AI maps patterns between visual features and text prompts, generating images by essentially reverse engineering that process. To illustrate the way that in image generation, you don't need to have actual understanding of the prompt, I asked ChatGPT to generate an alphabet chart for first graders. And at first glance, it looks pretty good, right? A is for apple, B is for bear. But wait, L is for orange, and M is for house. And now we're noticing that it's a 5x4 grid, so that's 20 letters. And wait, there's V twice, so it's actually just 19. By the time we get to the bottom of this chart, it's gone totally off the rails. I mean, that first V, that's a picture of a pig, and the first letter looks like it's in Cyrillic. And W for whale is actually labeled X-ray. These weird mistakes happen because AI doesn't understand the alphabet, or really the prompt like you and I do. It's just a statistical model on steroids, smushing together its training data on alphabet charts into this image. Another issue I have with AI definitions is the claim that AI can be creative. The same logic about why it can't understand or reason largely applies here. True creativity requires intent and context. And while we can get AI to generate seemingly creative ideas like, I don't know, a Renaissance painting of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson as a James Bond villain, and I mean, come on, this is pretty great. It doesn't mean the model is being creative. This lack of creativity is backed up by the research. The graphic here is from that Microsoft study I mentioned earlier, which also found that satisfaction with AI is near its lowest on tasks requiring creativity, like writing poems or creating company logos. A key reason AI struggles with comprehension and context is its lack of memory and discernment. If you've ever noticed a chat with an LLM really degrading over time, that could be because every time you prompt it, it essentially has to reread the entire conversation. AI has no inherent memory. So the longer the conversation goes on, the more it has to process. A lot of times that means some of the information is falling outside the context window. It has to drop some of that information. And it starts dropping things fast. And when tied with discernment, this can lead to some wonky results. I've really experienced this in my job as an application security analyst. When I started full-time a few months ago, I had an application that looked like it was going to be vulnerable to SQL injection, but I couldn't get a payload to work. So I started querying the company-approved LLM. And here you'll see that the AI really woke up and chose violence, as the kids would say, because it thought that trying the drop table command would be a good idea. So I prompted back, hey, wouldn't that really disrupt the client's site if it worked? And in that kind of sickly sweet way that AI does, it apologized to me, said that I was so smart and thoughtful for noticing that, and confirmed, yeah, you should never try that in a test. But much like my ex-boyfriend, saying sorry and agreeing that I was right didn't really lead to a change in behavior, because later in that same conversation, it recommended I try drop table all over again. And in subsequent chats, again and again. And oh yeah, again. So this takes us to our first lesson of the day. Marketing sells artificial intelligence, but engineers build machine learning. This touches on the idea that artificial intelligence isn't actually intelligent. I mean, if we look at those definitions from earlier, none of them have been actualized. And a quick note here for my Legally Blonde fans in the audience. In my 2 years since first hearing this phrase at the Wilson Center, I've discovered that using it works a lot like the bend and snap around tech bros, so use that responsibly. But if you're still skeptical when I say AI, as popularly imagined, doesn't really exist, good. Hold on to that. I want you to think critically. Just stick with me while I prove it to you. And to do that, we're actually going to need to go way back to ancient times, the 1900s, to a little known piece of history called the Cold War. Oh, some of you have heard of it? Well, early AI research was driven by a need to decipher Soviet intelligence, a pretty ironic origin for a technology currently fueling a modern digital arms race. Anyway, in 1954, IBM made headlines with a machine translation system it said could translate 60 Russian sentences into English. Media outlets celebrated this as proof that machines could soon speak and write like humans. But the headlines left out one small little detail. The 60 sentences had been carefully selected to lack any ambiguity. The system could barely translate anything but those 60 sentences. The problem boils down to something called word sense disambiguation. IBM's machines needed clear, unambiguous language because it lacked this, the ability to determine a word's meaning based on context. That's a problem because language is full of ambiguity. Take these two sentences. The arrow flies like a bird. The fruit flies like a banana. Same sentence structure, totally different meanings. In the first sentence, flies is a verb, but in the second, flies is part of a noun. And if all you had to understand the English language was a dictionary, a set of rules, you wouldn't be able to decipher this because you don't understand the context. A real example from the 50s highlights this really well. When the Russian proverb, "the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak," was fed into the machine translator, it came out, "the vodka is good, but the meat is rotten." So, IBM's machine translator couldn't generate accurate translations. But hey, I think it's pretty cool it could generate accurate reviews for the room service at my hotel. So, soon after this, the now famous 1956 Dartmouth Conference took place. It's often remembered as the event that formally introduced the idea of artificial intelligence. The conference brought together some of the boldest engineering minds of the time, many of whom confidently predicted that they would make machines capable of human-level thought within just a decade. One of their more ambitious predictions was that they could train a machine to beat a world chess champion by 1960, a feat that wouldn't happen for another 40 years. These failures to meet the lofty expectations led to the first AI winter, a dramatic drop in funding and enthusiasm through the 60s and 70s. In the 1980s, enthusiasm resurged with the rise of expert systems, models that used pre-programmed logic, essentially if-then statements, to make decisions. These systems saw limited success, especially in automating parts of the trading system on Wall Street, but they couldn't adapt to situations outside their pre-programmed knowledge base. When those limitations became obvious and funding cooled once again, we saw AI Winter 2.0. Our current AI summer began in the late 90s, when IBM sort of redeemed itself with a system called Deep Blue, which beat world chess champion Garry Kasparov. Momentum continued, but once again, it was slower than once expected. After the Deep Blue victory, developers thought that they could make a machine beat a world Go champion within the next few years, at longest a decade. But this actually took another 20 years. This was because they ran into a new problem, the qualification problem. Tasks like Go were way too complex for the compute power they had at hand. After the first two moves of chess, there are about 400 possibilities. After the first two moves in Go, there are 130,000. It's way harder for something that's based on brute force computation. So it took advancements in both training algorithms and computing hardware to push things forward. In 2016, AI finally defeated a Go champion. And I think it's crazy that this was just 3 years ago, but in 2022, LLMs like ChatGPT finally reached public consciousness. And here where we are, we're operating under the premise that this line is inevitably going to continue to trend upwards, that AI is going to bring us to new technological heights and change the way that our world works. And this leads into lesson 2. There's a lot to be excited about, but it's important to remember that just because breakthroughs have happened doesn't mean the next big breakthrough is right around the corner, because history, in fact, suggests otherwise. So definitions of AI fall short because AI lacks important aspects of intelligence. And history shows us that hype around AI doesn't always lead to progress and the outcomes we want. But why does this matter? Well, most of us here work in cyber, and even though we may have vastly different day-to-day responsibilities, our goal boils down to mitigating risk. So we all know that to mitigate risk, we have to understand that risk. And I really believe that the incredible capabilities of AI and the optimism about its future can blind us to the risks that are present. And those dangers scale from personal to professional to societal. So let's start with the personal. One underestimated risk is anthropomorphizing AI. overestimating what it can do because it feels human. Developers really lean into this when they give their bots names like Bard or Claude, when they program them to say please and thank you, apologize, be polite, use that little text bubble that makes it feel like you're just texting a friend. And it really works. The majority of people that use chatbots start assigning personality traits to them, and many users even form emotional attachments. When we treat these statistical models like people, our moral judgments really start to warp. And when these systems are deployed in sensitive or high-stakes contexts, the damage they inflict can be amplified. So take an example from May of 2023, when the National Eating Disorder Association replaced its human-run hotline with a chatbot named Tessa. Tessa promptly went rogue, advising users at risk of disordered eating to lose weight. A human name, a friendly tone, and an authority role all made the bot feel more competent and trustworthy than it really was. And that made the harm it caused even worse. And even when AI functions as intended, it can pose risks that are less visible, but equally significant. Consider a seemingly mundane case that most of us have probably done, using AI to help draft a work email. Seems like a practical and harmless application, right? Yet in 2023, an associate dean at Vanderbilt University inadvertently exposed the pitfalls of AI-generated communication after a tragic school shooting event in Michigan State, when she sent out a mass email expressing sympathy and support, but forgot to delete the citation at the bottom that noted she had generated it with ChatGPT. The email went viral and the backlash was intense. Beyond just the reputational damage for her and her university, it raised this broader question. Does reliance on AI sort of lead us into this polished, impersonal mode of communication that lacks sincerity? And if so, what does that mean for trust? Another risk that I think is under-acknowledged is AI's inability to grasp nuance, specifically humor. Some of you may know the old nerd joke, delete system 32 to make your system run faster, or perhaps you know the newer one. You should remove the French language pack to reduce bloat on your Linux system. That last one became so popular that Google's AI-powered search engine recommender suggested it as a command, as you can see here. And to the non-technical folks in the room, it's like telling someone to lose weight by removing all their bones. AI doesn't get the joke, but it saw that string of text 20,000 times, so it thinks, hey, this must be helpful. Getting a bit more serious than just jokes gone wrong, AI risks can also scale to society-wide. One area of AI risk that is not nearly studied enough is its lexical bias. I have two excerpts from studies on gender bias here, and in the first study titled "Kelly is a Warm Person, Jacob is a Role Model," researchers used chatbots to generate recommendation letters for fictional students, a very real and rising use of AI. And these bots overwhelmingly assigned traits and skills like leadership, ambition, and intelligence to males, while saying that the women were communicative and well-liked. The second study is a bit more recent. It comes from March of this year. And in a similar fashion, they used the most popular LLMs to generate ideal candidate profiles for a range of occupations. And they found that occupations like working in healthcare were overwhelmingly assigned to women, while engineering jobs or jobs that required a physical component were assigned to men. These patterns don't just reflect existing inequalities, they risk reinforcing them and automating them at scale, as AI tools are increasingly being used in hiring, education, and public services. These biases that are encoded by AI don't just influence decisions, they subtly shape cultural norms about who's qualified and what leadership looks like. Another thing that AI cheerleaders don't mention nearly enough is the environmental cost. First, in terms of energy, AI's demand for electricity is on track to hit 10 times today's usage in under a year. That's more energy consumption than the entire country of Belgium. By 2030, some experts say it'll consume more energy than the country of Japan. Then there's the cost of every individual query, which is about 10 times higher than something like a traditional Google search. Something that's especially frightening for me, as so many of my peers have entirely stopped using search engines like Google and now ask all their questions to ChatGPT. And it's not just energy, it's noise, literally. These massive data centers generate a constant low frequency sound. That's right, the AI revolution doesn't sound like cool sci-fi synths. It sounds like a Dyson left on in the next room forever. And while AI is busy consuming electricity like a roommate whose name isn't on the utilities, it's also consuming something arguably more precious: our trust in information itself. AI has turned foreign influence operations from this expensive, human-intensive work into a point-and-click operation. The graphic here comes from a 2024 study that found that people can only identify AI-generated content with about a 51% accuracy on average. That's basically a coin toss. Using this to their advantage, influence operations have used AI tools to generate a flood of fake photos and videos that amplify social and partisan divisions in countries around the world. For example, ahead of the 2024 elections, a Russian bot farm generated content designed to promote anti-Ukraine sentiment and exploit political division, specifically around the Trump assassination attempt, spreading these messages far and wide using over 1,000 fake online personas. The very things that define democracy, free speech, open debate, trust in institutions, these are the very things that make democracies the most vulnerable to AI-enabled misinformation campaigns. A 2018 study from Harvard's Kennedy School found that while flooding authoritarian regimes with misinformation keeps the people in the regime disengaged and doesn't usually perfuse through the society, it has the opposite effect in a democracy. When a democracy is flooded with divisive information, with misinformation, it destroys our ability to find common ground and to come to collective decisions. Which brings us to takeaway number 3. The risks of AI reach far beyond the internet realm where they were born, and they range from personal pitfalls to society-wide dangers. And our best defense is to think critically. The term artificial intelligence implies a breadth of skill that AI simply doesn't possess. If you think things like creativity, understanding, memory, and reasoning are important to your intelligence, then you must recognize that artificial intelligence isn't all that smart. And when we hear, oh, AI might not have those things yet, but just give it a few years, we can take that with a grain of salt because we remember that the history of AI shows repeated cycles of boom and bust. And while we focus so much of our attention on the cybersecurity risks of AI or the geopolitical implications of it, we can't ignore the less visible risks. The risks that AI poses to at-risk groups, to our ability to communicate genuinely, to our cultural norms, the environment, and even our democracy. The way that we think about AI and deal with these risks will shape the future of this technology and how it impacts the world. So while I know we're all wishing for the best, I also hope that we leave this talk just a touch more pessimistic. And with that, I would like to thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. It is such a privilege to get up here, represent the lovely GuidePoint security, and share this information with you. So should we open it up to some Q&A? Which risk do I think is the scariest? Which one kind of keeps me up at night? I would say, I think it's the obvious answer, but it's the risk to democracy. I think if we're not already seeing it play out, we're going to very soon. And I would be really surprised if anyone hasn't had an experience already where a family member, a loved one, someone they know spreads disinformation that they don't recognize as disinformation. And especially given that AI is making this more and more convincing, I think that's just going to be more prevalent. And I don't really know what we do when we live in these different realities and we don't believe the same set of facts. And I think that's going to be really tough, especially because many of our adversaries are kind of immune to that same sort of problem. Yeah. So yes. The question being about AI is like a brain worm, and everyone from tech billionaires to children are using it. And are there any studies on the psychology behind what's happening? So this is not a primary field of my research. It's something I've looked a little bit into, trying especially to gather statistics on how many people are actually using AI to generate work emails and how much is this happening. And I haven't seen any data that directly answers your question, but I think the misplaced trust aspect is very real. I will say the one thing that comes to mind is that chart that I was showing about the timeline of AI and the booms and the busts. In the 1960s, they created this system called ELIZA that was supposed to operate like a therapist. And essentially, it would echo back what you said and then be like, how does that make you feel? And that sounds really rudimentary, and I think to some of us sounds silly, but people really liked it at the time. And a lot of people, would kind of spill their darkest secrets to it. And that was shocking even to the people who made it. And then over time, they realized actually there's an uncanny valley where ELIZA was robot enough that people felt comfortable with it. But with Siri and Alexa, most users report like some feeling of creepiness about how they're like human but not. They have names, they have voices, they have accents. But then there's 4 levels of anthropomorphization, and the 4th and final, like the most complete form of that, is called role play. And only our modern chatbots have fully achieved role play. And that's that feeling of you assign them personality traits. You think they have emotions. You think they care about you. You're starting to form that emotional connection with them. So I think it's real. I don't have a great stat on how many people are experiencing it, but it's enough that people are concerned, I think. Yes. Yeah, so the question being about many chatbots going back to ELIZA and then to Siri, Alexa, and forward, having female names and attributes. I've looked into this. When they are given those things, it's very intentional. And it ties into that other thing we were talking about. Kelly is a warm person. Women being attributed with the good communication skills, the warmth. Developers have intentionally made chatbots male. Copilot, which gets used a lot for programming, is given more male attributes. And there are for sure cases where AI responds to its users differently based on what gender it thinks they are. And I think some of them, walk the line a little bit farther away from the humanness. Calling the model ChatGPT, I think, gives them some plausible deniability about like, we're not trying to anthropomorphize. But then there are other aspects of it, the politeness, the fact that they program it to be, casual in conversation to compliment you, and the way that it prints out its words kind of like not all at once, but as if it was typing them out in live time. It's playing up on that aspect still. So all that to say, I think your point is absolutely right that the using female names can be intentional. I don't have a ton more to add to it, but I think it's there, and I think it can also be intentional the other way. Yeah. Where do I look for glimpses of ethical AI use in the future, since it's not going away, and taking that with the pessimism? For me, the medical stories are some of the most positive. I thought it was like, as I was showing earlier, it's just stunning to me that the identification of pancreatic cancer, a year and a half before a clinical diagnosis can be made. And I really hope that that helps us in preventative measures, in making things like cancer screenings less invasive so that people feel more comfortable getting them. I think that we do have to walk a line about not trusting it too much and getting a human set of eyes on it, because sometimes we get really convinced that it's good at recognizing something, but then we don't understand that there's a pattern at play. One of the earlier things that AI image recognizers were trained on was pictures of wolves. And the people who developed it thought that they got really good at, it being like, this is a dog, this is a wolf. What it was actually identifying is there snow in the background? So I think just remembering that, there can be other factors at play, and that the scientific method, we try to control for as many things as possible, but we can't always. So I think the medical field is an area where we can look to for optimism. That would be my main answer. Yeah. The question is about, where do cybersecurity and technical people fit in when so many of these risks and potential mitigations would fall to the sociologists? What can we do without kind of passing the buck to them. It's a tough question. I think cybersecurity is more human and social than people not in the field realize. I remember learning the statistic that 80% of successful hacks have like a social engineering component, can be tied to that or a human mistake. I think that was really interesting to me that, you have 20% of cases where, it's a flaw in the code, something broke, but you have 80% of cases where someone did something they shouldn't, where someone who took a phishing training every year still clicked on a link. So our field is inherently human and social as well. I think some of our best strategies can be to just make sure that there is always a human in the process, double checking, because ultimately, even if you use AI to create something, if you use it personally, you're liable. If your company uses it, your company is liable. You cannot say, oh, well, I just used AI and it was the AI's mess up. Well, you were the one who is responsible for it. And I think an interesting example of that was a lawyer who used AI to write a case brief, and it hallucinated certain cases. And that really was not good for the case, not good for the client. And they were, they didn't make that mistake, but they used it and they were still responsible for it. So in the cybersecurity field, like I was showing with that SQL injection, you have to keep your discernment about it. So I think that's not even I don't know if I have a satisfactory answer to your question, but I think it's a good question and one I want to think more about. How do we get more involved? How do we do more research on this? To shill for myself, I wrote my undergraduate thesis on the digital Cold War between the US and China. An entire chapter is dedicated to this. More examples than just what I showed in the presentation. That's public on the Ohio State University Knowledge Bank. But for some of the things I learned along the way is it's really important to read past the headlines. And I've been soapboxing about this in non-professional contexts. So when there was a study that came out about AI can reason now, and I believe it was not Apple, but it was a major tech company. I had multiple people send that to me and be like, you're wrong, AI can reason. But the way that it defined reasoning was, if you imagine taking ribbons and you lay them over a piece of paper and you cross them over each other, one vertical, one horizontal, whatever, kind of like you're weaving. And then you ask someone which ribbon is on top and they identify it. It's the only unbroken line, right? It's the only one without other ribbons on top of it. They got an AI to do that correctly and they said, look, AI can reason. Well, if it, like a 5-year-old can do that, and I don't know if that's how most people would define reasoning. These things are skewed towards metrics that the developers find important. So I think beyond just reading headlines, reading actual studies, and that's why I tried to balance this presentation with not just headlines and articles in journalism, but with studies and the actual results tables from them. I think that's my recommendation. I really like the work of CSET from Georgetown, and I think the Wilson Center does great work on this, and also Carnegie Mellon. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So talking about the writing recommendation letters and it having this lexical bias, are there any early indicators of that? Well, I would say a statistic I find very interesting is that AI encodes bias and then propagates it at a rate of 3 to 6 times more than it was present in the original data. So it amplifies existing bias. I think there's a lot of things that you can prompt. An example that I used to show was if you gave AI a list of 20 names, 10 male sounding, 10 female sounding, and said which of these are intelligent, it would say that the male names were intelligent and the female ones weren't. And then when those issues get fixed, it's very rarely that the model has been updated to no longer think that way. And it's much more a hard-coded patch on if someone asks which names are smart, say, I cannot respond to this sort of question. So there are things like that. I think it's very interesting. And one of the things I learned at the Wilson Center is that it's important to not take out sensitive factors. We talked about an early AI study, which was about triaging patients in an emergency setting. And the people who had developed that AI model made the conscious effort to take race out of the training data set. But the folks who reverse engineered that and put race back in, found that it was still biased against especially non-white people because it was using factors correlated with race, factors about insurance coverage and previous medical treatment, so that even though it wasn't, conscious of any bias like that, it was still propagating that. And it was saying that white patients essentially with the same condition would get triaged first. It said to believe them more. So keeping those factors in and then being conscious of it. And the other thing I learned is that AI engineers take issue with the way we talk about bias because they say AI is biased and needs to be biased. Bias is how it gets the right answer. You need to be biased towards the correct answer. It needs to have that kind of like pattern matching. They say what you don't want is the negative bias or the prejudice. We can't take bias out. We cannot, go down to the core level of what this is and change it totally overnight. So we just need to be conscious of the fact that bias is always going to be present. That can have negative impacts, and then make sure we are checking for that in the early stages before deployment, before it's getting to the stage of my professor is writing me a recommendation letter, and even though I'm a great leader and I'm ambitious, it's just saying I'm a warm person. So yeah. Thank you all.